All right, mail time. About a month ago, we did a story on how the formula for how Idaho lottery money helps Idaho schools would be and how it would be changing for just the third time in 35 years. It's going to be going back to being split between funding school district facilities and the state's permanent buildings. So that prompted Jim in Canyon County to write in. He appreciated the piece on the lottery funds. How about the history of sales tax that started at 3% with a sunset, which obviously didn't happen? It was sold as going to schools, as I recall, said Jim. Well, Jim, you're close. The 3% thing and going to schools, that part is correct. Check on that. The sunset, though, not so much. And with the new fiscal year now about a week old, we thought it would be a good time to revisit Idaho revenues. So let's take you back to 1965. When the legislative session convened, Governor Robert Smiley wanted several things. He wanted to create a constitutional revision committee. He wanted a state water resource agency, a state park system, and a statewide junior college system. Well, Governor Smiley got all those things and one more thing, something that was tried 3 times before. 59 years ago, the 38th Idaho legislature was considered the most productive and progressive in the state's history. Perhaps none captured that more than what was considered the top story of 1965. You see, kids, in the news business, each news gathering force makes its own evaluation
of the top stories of the year. And this is the way the Channel 7 News team views the year 1965. 1965 was a year of changes, and a good many of them came from beneath the Idaho State House dome.
And those changes began with Governor Robert Smiley's State of the State address that January.
Ladies and gentlemen of the 38th session of the Idaho Legislature.
When the Republican incumbent proposed a statewide sales tax, or
the budget, when it reaches you,
in other words,
will be based upon and will recommend,
with more words,
the enactment of a retail sales and use tax designed to produce revenue adequate to the needs of these expanded services.
Governor Smiley's detractors also had other words for it.
True, the course is hazardous.
Political suicide.
But in my considered political judgment, not nearly as hazardous as failure to act.
That delayed applause, an indication of the contentious legislative debate.
We do have this great responsibility.
That would follow.
If you regard yourselves, senators, as conservatives, then you ought to be supporting House Bill 222.
House Bill 222 would reduce income and property taxes by $26 million.
We've shifted the burden of taxation onto the little people.
To make up for it, it would also install a first-ever sales tax of 3%, with dividends dedicated to Idaho public schools.
The only practical and the only feasible means of meeting the needs of our schools and of our state government. If you regard yourselves as liberals, you should be supporting this legislation, because we cannot do those things for the people that we ought to be doing for the people without this kind of legislation.
It wouldn't be an easy sell.
Have one of the highest income taxes in the nation. We have one of the highest property taxes in the nation.
We take this sales tax road, my friends, we never get off of it. Bill will only whet the appetite to spend and to spend and to spend. There's no turning back. It's like relying upon a crutch. A muscle becomes flabby. You can't do without it.
But in the end,
roll call shows 26 ayes, 18 nays.
The Senate bought in.
House Bill number 222 has passed the Senate.
Governor Smiley would have his signature sales tax, at least for the time being.
Anti-sales taxes were successful in gathering enough signatures to put the question of retaining or repealing the tax before the Idaho voters in the 1966 election.
The next November, 61% of Idaho voters upheld the sales tax. But at the same time, likely because of his leaning towards the levy, they decided to ditch Governor Smiley and replace him with a new Republican leader. I don't know who that senator was who said we'll never go back. He was correct, because Idaho's had a sales tax ever since 1965. And Jim, you mentioned that sales tax sunsetting. It never did. And that was never part of the plan. But that term did come into play decades later, starting with that 3% in 1965, and then again voter approved in 1966. Idaho stuck with that number until March of 1983. That began an era of volatility, which pushed the sales tax to 4%, then 4.5% 3 months later, then 30 days later it was back to 4%. By April of 1986, Idaho's consumers were paying 5% on purchases, and it stayed that way until May of 2003, when we saw 6% for the very first time. Okay, so that's where Jim's sunset comes into play, because House Bill 400 in 2003 set an end date of June 30th, 2005 in hopes of increasing general fund revenues by $13 million. But in August of 2006, Jim Risch, well, now Senator Jim Risch, he was halfway through a 7-month term as governor, having been appointed by Dirk Kempthorne to finish out his term when he left to run the Department of the Interior. In a one-day special session in August of 2006, Risch convinced the legislature to cut property taxes for public schools by $260 million, but pushing them to rely on income taxes and a new sales tax rate of 6%. That November, 72% of voters agreed to the sales tax increase. There was no real tax relief either. And we also got, well, 2 years later, schools, they got kicked in the teeth because of the Great Recession because of that bill. Well, finally, just 4.5 years ago, Senator Jim Risch of Caldwell, he pitched an idea of pushing the sales tax to nearly 8%, with that extra money going to Idaho schools and a goal of getting rid of the need for supplemental levies, but that went nowhere. So we've had several raises to the state sales tax since 1965, but none since voters overwhelmingly approved taking it to 6% in 2006. And again, we've been that way since.